All right. We are broadcasting live to our friends across the world. You can't hear me right now, so I will do a mime of what I'm saying, which is basically welcome to this final presentation by Madam Machado. And what I'm going to do is just turn it over. One of the ways that we function here at Soros Place is through the love and generosity of our community and volunteers. And a very important volunteer is the community host. And they have interacted with the resident, even possibly more than I have. So what I love to do at these events is have the community host introduce the resident for the final event, and that is Sam Machado.
MVP. Hi everyone, I'm Sam Marchidi, the community host. No, you're good. I'm used to it. The community host for Soros Place, and I've gotten to know Amanda during their stay here. It's been super fun. Amanda is a writer and focuses a lot on travel, queer Latinx subjects, and recently they've been kind of delving into their local roots in the Boise area. Like, they have family here, so it's been really fun seeing that experience, like her going through the records and stuff. So yeah, I'll let her take it away. Amanda.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you all for being here. This is so incredible to see everyone here. Shout out to the friends on the live stream. I'm so glad you're here with me. It's really special to have them there watching. Thank you to Soros Place, to Jody, to Sam, who's been the best Boise tour guide, queer tour guide. I got the best queer tour of Boise I could ever imagine through Sam and Sergio, so thank you all so much. And thank you to Soros Place for giving me like truly a magical month here. It's been really, really incredible. As Sam said, I've had family that lived in Boise. You'll hear the story in a minute. So it feels really special to return here through this residency. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit more about the strange journey of my work in general, what kind of writing I did before and how I arrived at the writing I'm going to share today. So we're going to start with just like a little slide of where I've been and how I got here. So in the first 5 years of my work, I focused on writing stories mostly about how systems of oppression were embedded in the way we travel and experience the outdoors. So I wrote about diversifying outdoor recreation. I wrote about the limits of ethical and sustainable travel. I wrote about the effect of colonization and white supremacy on the environmentalist movement. And then through that work, in the last 3 years, I began teaching a workshop which was called Reclaiming Nature Writing, which aimed to expand the nature writing genre to include writers of color who had always written about nature in different ways, but often were excluded from the category of being deemed nature writers. So a lot of the topics I wrote about were, again, colonization, gender violence, race, white supremacy, and the intersection of that in the nature writing genre. So this was kind of my beat. This was like a large percentage of my work for many years. But this is not exactly the kind of work I'm going to be reading today, because around 2019, a big shift happened. Lots of shifts happened. The first thing that happened was I realized I was gay, very, very gay, and came out to my family and then came out publicly in my writing for the first time that year. After that, I also became estranged from lots of family members for the same reason. And then the pandemic happened, and feeling isolated from my blood family, I decided I wanted to start doing ancestry research and reconnect with my family many generations back and try to find some kind of queer lineage in my family. So then my writing shifted a lot to these topics, and I ended up publishing a lot of essays about survivorship, about sexuality, about gender, and one of these included an essay for Guernica, which was called A Lineage of Non-Consent. And that essay unpacked a lot of what I had done in my research. And it made me understand that as a Latinx person of Spanish and indigenous descent, in many ways, my lineage has always been non-consensual and continued that way for generations. And so as someone who identifies as a survivor and someone who is trying to unpack how my queerness intersected with my survivorship, that was a really meaningful thing to think about, how I inherit that history. So that kind of brings us to where we are today in the title of my reading today. As I was doing a lot of this writing, I got into a residency in Massachusetts. This was my first long-term residency last year. And I was writing about the lineage of non-consent in my family. I was writing about my own queerness. I was writing about estrangement. And And I realized what I was actually searching for was queer lineage. After experiencing how queerness had distanced me from my family, I wanted to figure out where my queerness came from. I wanted queerness to have an origin story in my lineage. I wanted to find a way that it could bring me back to my family rather than farther and farther away. So as I kept writing on queer lineage, my writing kept landing on one ancestor in particular over and over again, and that was my grandmother. My grandmother was also a survivor. I had been told since I was a little girl that the reason why we immigrated to this country was because she was escaping her physically abusive boyfriend. But after she came to the US, I always kind of from afar had a distant admiration for her and the kind of like hippie life she led. So this is her in the Sequoias in California on her way to Boise when she's driving over to here to live here. So after she came to the US, she ended up marrying someone who was named Mr. Frank and got citizenship and visas for her and the rest of her family. And then they all moved to Boise here in 1979 and lived here off and on for 10 years. What I discovered during my month here is that in 1981, she filed for divorce from Mr. Frank, which is not the story that was told in our family, so I'm still trying to figure that out. Her divorce paper is right up there. I posted it on the board, what I found at the Boise Library. It was published in the Idaho Statesman, which is also wild, that the Idaho Statesman just like published divorces in the 80s. Anyways, so she lived here single for a period of time, and then she decided to start making herbal medicine tinctures and capsules and selling them to Latino communities around Boise and then also to migrant workers on the border with Oregon. And that would be her work. That's how she supported herself until the end of her life, by selling her herbal medicine. So my grandmother and I never had a relationship while she was alive. The last time I saw my grandmother or even spoke to her was when I was 10 years old. The estrangement with my grandmother also comes from a variety of reasons, also family conflicts, lack of financial means, the fact that we always lived thousands of miles away. So there was many barriers that made it so that I never saw her for the decades before she died, which was when I was around 22 years old. But at this residency, my writing kept landing on her. And in Massachusetts, a series of spooky events that I won't get into today started happening during that residency that kind of became the beginning of the journey of this book project that I'm going to be reading from today, which is writing about the journey of longing for ancestors, searching for queer lineage after estrangement, finding my grandmother in the middle of that, and everything that happened next. So I'm going to read a few excerpts. We're going to jump around a lot, but I hope you guys can bear with me. I'll try to give as much context as I can before each reading. And so this first one is called 18 Mothers, and it's about this first moments of contact with my grandmother at the residency. And it's based on this quote that I found on Tumblr. Online, someone posts, "Let's say your matrilineal line is fairly consistent, and everyone has their daughter at 25. So 4 women in your matrilineal line are born every 100 years. In 1,000 years, that's only 40 women. In 2,000 years, 80 women. So basically, 0 AD started roughly 80 mothers ago. That's it. 80 women in 2,000 years. That means in what is currently called Mexico, my lineage had 18 mothers since the beginning of colonization. I am writing about 4 of them, or 100 years, or around 1/5 of all mothers since colonization began. What are the implications of tracking time through a measurement of mothers? It means we track time based on what women held, what was done to them, what their bodies endured, what they inherited, and what they passed on. Tracking time with mothers feels like the realest measurement of time there is. It feels like the only kind of time I can actually feel in my body. I feel those 18 mothers inside me somehow, and the final 3 the most. Online, a friend shows me a chart showing that a person's womb already carries the next 2 generations of mothers inside her body. Because a womb has all the eggs it will ever produce, that means the egg that became me was already inside my mother while she grew inside my grandmother's womb. Which means, abuelita, I existed inside you for a time, that there are cells of me that touch the cells of you. This science feels so affirming. We were not separate once, not as separate as you felt during those last decades of your life. We do not feel very separate now. In these last months that I've been writing this, sometimes I think I can hear you. I walk around these days and sometimes the air next to me feels heavy, with a presence I cannot see or hear or touch, but somehow feel is there. One afternoon, I go to open the drawer where I've stored all of your leftover medicine, and the door snaps completely off. the content of the drawer collapsing on the floor, but the glass bottles with the tinctures of your medicine somehow never break. The whole thing feels loud, like someone trying to get my attention, and I look around my room after, wondering if it's you. Maybe it is you. Maybe it is the 18 mothers. Maybe it is all the mothers in my body trying to tell me, trying to say, look at what you carry. Please don't do the same thing. So after those spooky things started happening, I wrote this piece that's called Questions I Secretly Wish I Could Ask the Women in My Lineage. And so I'm going to read that one next. Question number 1. What did you do with your lust? Did you allow it of yourself, or did you hide it in the moment it showed up? And if not, where did you put it? What did you do with all that energy? Did you ever use it as something to propel you towards something, even as you kept it secret? 2. How did you masturbate? How did you learn? How did you hide it from your siblings, your own mother? How did you hide it from your husband? What or who inspired you? Did touching yourself ever feel like some kind of sustenance? Did it ever feel like some kind of gift? 3. What were your obsessions, your weird patterns of delight? A sensation that oddly stirred something in you, something you didn't even know could be moved. Did you ever giggle at the mischief of these strange desires, your kinks, your fetishes, even if you didn't call them that at the time? 4. Did you even like being a woman? Would you have chosen woman if you had been given another choice? What of women felt like home to you? What felt misaligned or unnatural? Was there boy in you? Could you feel it at times with certain people on certain days? Did that scare you or delight you? Did you wonder about any of these questions too? Did you ever think about your own mother's sexuality, her gender, her desires, her body? What cycles did you break? Which couldn't you help but repeat? How were you determined to not become your mother? What liberation did you find? What work do I not know that has already been done? So I wrote those questions at the residency. And then, as I said, spooky shit started happening with my grandmother. It seemed like she was listening. And what happened then was that as I was in the residency with a lot of time on my hands, I remembered that in my early 20s, my mother had told me that my grandmother had a diary. And this was kind of a legend in our family for years, but most people insisted the diary was lost. It never existed in the first place. Either way, no one ever had the time or means to go on the journey to retrieving it, which would mean going to the house where my grandmother died, which was in Iowa. After a convincing pep talk from a friend, during that residency, I decided to book a ticket to visit my uncle in the house where my grandmother died and finally search for the manuscript. And that was June 4th of last year. And when I took the trip to the house, I found that my uncle, Francisco Martinez, had actually held on to it and preserved it for decades without telling anyone. It was totally real. And when I saw it, I realized it actually wasn't a diary. It was a book. It was a memoir. It had chapter titles and page numbers and literary devices. It was a memoir that told the story of her life from her childhood through her abusive marriage to her ex-husband, to her escaping and immigrating here to the United States. And so that's the photo of it the day I got it, and it's actually there on the altar now, the photocopied version. And that's me with my uncle when we were trying to organize the pages together when I first saw him last summer. So by talking to my uncle, I realized that the first draft of this book was actually written in 1986 in Boise. It was when she had divorced Mr. Frank, and it was when she was living here alone by herself and starting to support herself. So she wrote it in a tiny house on Longmont Street that I went to go visit on my first week here. So I like to think about it as her own little residency that she had in Boise decades before I did. So that's why I put her name next to mine. I don't know if you guys noticed in the front, but I read in some of the writing by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. I don't know if you know that writer, but she's one of my favorites. And she has the phrase ancestrally co-written. And that's really what my writing in here has felt like. That's what this whole project has felt like. It feels like we've been writing it together. So it just felt like appropriate to have her name there next to mine under this residency. So the next part I'm going to read is the experience of reading her book. So this passage is called Leerte. I once had a lover who I used to exchange letters with in Spanish. Every time he received one, he would tell me, me gusta leerte, which translates directly to, I love to read you. I loved the directness of this phrase. In English, we would say, I love reading your letters, or I love reading your writing. But in Spanish, he said he loved reading you, which felt so much more intimate. It makes it sound as if reading is like touching, as if my essence was so entangled within my words that reading my writing became the same thing as reading me, like they were one and the same, my writing and myself. This is what it feels like to read your book. I love reading you. I love the you embedded in your writing, your soul and heart and mind suddenly present again after all these years of absence. I love that your writing makes everything about you almost physical again, like I am reaching you even from so far away and after so long. Sometimes after reading, I scrunch my body into a cuddled position on the bed, and I swear I can feel you there cuddling me back. Within the first few pages, I notice you use a lot of literary techniques. You mention your curiosity and longing for the United States in a way that almost feels like foreshadowing for when you'll immigrate there later. You write about my father, who was a colonel. Then you cross out my father and change it to a man showed up who was a colonel, as if you were trying to create suspense by not giving away all the details all at once. Over and over again, I notice how many revisions you've made throughout each page of this manuscript. The moments when you've changed your mind about where to place certain stories or when to reveal certain details. An allegory about a scorpion is first written on the bottom of page 7, then crossed out, moved to a few pages later. Witnessing your revisions makes me feel so close to you, that we both placed so much effort in writing, that we wrote not only for catharsis, but also for craft, that we both believed so strongly in the power of a story worth telling well. I love reading you as a writer. I love becoming intimate with your writerly choices, your diction, your own patterns in vocabulary and sentence structure, the way you often begin paragraphs by saying sin más ni más, or often transition through time by saying pasaron los meses, the way you love using dialogue to capture the emotions of a scene, the way you sometimes let your emotions run wild on the page, and other times meticulously care about clarity. One night I read through a paragraph where you cross out a word you had just used already in that same sentence, and above it, you write a synonym. Quickly, my writer mind thinks, smart revision, yes. And then suddenly I feel a giant wave of tenderness at this moment, at you and I communicating across time and space and death as two writers, as if we were reading and revising this manuscript together. So there's a lot of trauma in this book, and I really struggled today to figure out what part of the manuscript I actually wanted to read out loud and which parts I didn't. My grandmother, as I said before, was a survivor, and she wrote about her survivor experiences in explicit detail in this manuscript. She was sexually assaulted first by her first boss at her first job when she was 16 years old. She writes about that within the first 5 pages of the book. Then she was assaulted again by her first doctor in her first pregnancy. She writes about that as well. She was physically assaulted many times by her husband, and those details are in the manuscript as well. And because of the shame at the time towards women who left their husbands, what is repeated over and over again through the manuscript is that no one would help her, that she would escape her husband asking for a place to sleep, and most people would turn her down. The first domestic violence shelter in the United States, from what I believe, was not built until the 80s, and in Mexico was way later than that. So this story takes place in the 50s and 60s, right, and 40s to some extent. So it really gave a lot of context for what she was actually dealing with and why she needed to escape to the US to move her life forward. So as incredibly hard as it was to read her stories, it also gave new perspective to my own stories and made me see the patterns that had continued. I'm also a survivor of sexual assault. I was also in a relationship in my 20s that I eventually left because it became physically abusive. So seeing those patterns was a really intense and jarring experience, but in some ways also a really healing one to see where a lot of this lineage continues. So as I thought about what to share today, I thought really deeply about whether I wanted to share these excerpts of these traumatic experiences. And I realized what was most important was not actually what happened to her, but what it means that she was able to write about what happened to her and how her writing about her trauma helped me heal my own trauma. So instead, I'm going to read reflections on that. We're going to skip 100 pages in the manuscript and go to the reflections instead. A few months into reading the manuscript, I grab drinks with another writer friend and I tell her about this project. I tell her some of the stories my grandmother wrote, stories about the violence that happened to her, of family secrets that no one else confronted, of depression and poverty and the hopelessness of trying to immigrate. What my friend says is, what I'm struck by is the conversation your grandmother had to have with herself first in order to write what she wrote. She tells me that a person in her writing class once shared that she once found her grandmother's journals too, but they were all about the weather, my friend says. In order to begin writing down what she decided to write about, you have to first experience an internal process within yourself, she said. You have to first speak with yourself a certain way, the kind of way that opens yourself up to writing about something deeper than the weather, something about the ways life hurt and healed you. Your grandmother managed to do that, she said. In his book, The Message, Ta-Nehisi Coates defines writing as the need to haunt, which is to say, to make people feel all that is now at stake. That's what reading your book felt like, a brutal confrontation with what is at stake, what has been done and what has been inherited, and what must be healed if our family is to move on. And when defined this way, then I begin to feel foolish that I was ever afraid of you or my ancestors at all. I begin to see haunting not as something scary, but just as the visceral reminder of our duty. In his book, Coates mentions the practice he has before he sits down to write. He first reads passages of writing from enslaved people, from their own memoirs, testimonies, books. This is his practice for remembering. I am not alone, he writes. I am in a tradition. This too is how I feel now after discovering your book, that in my family I am no longer alone, not only as a queer person, but also as a writer, that I too am in a tradition of women who name what happened to them, a tradition of women who haunt those that are still alive. When I think of you that way, the fear I had before, again, dissipates. And you deciding to show yourself at my residency makes all the sense in the world. A space that connects what we have in common, a space that holds our tradition. Ancestors live on for me not as ghosts, but through words, Coates writes. Since I received your book, many times I have spoken to the empty air, asking for you to show yourself, to allow me to finally see you, no matter how brief the visitation may be. This is the first time in my life I've ever asked for something like this, to willingly ask to be haunted, to name a desire for seeing a ghost. I tell myself that I can handle it. I tell myself this time I won't be afraid. But maybe this was asking for too much or misunderstanding everything. I already have seen your ghost by reading your book. I have the immense gift of having experienced a visitation through words, the most apt supernatural experience a writer could ever want. I think about myself years ago, wishing I had a grandmother like other grandmothers, the grief I felt of never having a grandmother who sent me birthday cards or knit me sweaters, the kind of grandmother who came to my graduation or sat next to me in her rocking chair on Christmas. But I also did not have a grandmother who sat down to write and wrote about the weather. I had a grandmother who wrote about assault and violence and single motherhood. I had a grandmother who wrote about fallen women and misogyny and the secrets our families have hidden about women for centuries. I had a grandmother who understood the need to haunt. I had a grandmother who knew what was at stake. So this manuscript wasn't all sad. There were some parts that were incredibly happy. And the miracle of reading this manuscript was that the happiest part I found during Pride weekend. A particularly difficult Pride weekend last year, where I came home kind of demoralized that Pride wasn't as fun as I thought it was going to be, and was like, maybe I should just read, pick a page from the manuscript, see what happens. And the page I landed on was an entire story about her falling in love with a man named David. And though there's no dates mentioned or location, I'm pretty sure this happened in Boise after she got divorced from Mr. Frank. And so since it happened here, I just felt like this is actually what I should be reading here, is the story of Mr. Frank and the divorce and David. So this is the passage I want to read directly from her. Her passages are all in Spanish, but I've done my best to translate it. So she's divorced now. She's living probably in that house in Longmont Street, I'm assuming. And David has asked her out on a date. Finally, the day arrived. I dressed in my best strawberry-colored dress and waited for him for a few seconds in the living room. He knocked on the door and came in with a brand new leather jacket. He seemed to me to be the most handsome man in the world that I had ever seen, with those blue eyes and that charming smile he had. He hugged me and told me he was ready to go. We climbed into his truck, and the whole way he held my hand and asked me where I would like to go dancing. I don't know how to dance, I said, and I don't know anything about this city, so I'm happy to go wherever you want to go. Well, he answered, there's a place nearby where my nephew plays in the band. It's country music, and we're going to have a good time. From the moment we arrived and he took me dancing, I realized that he was an expert and had the ability to lead me with incredible ease. There I realized that I had enjoyed very little in my life, and that with him I was going to enjoy everything I had lost in my youth. This man was good-looking, loving, understanding, kind, Christian. He had no vices, but he was poor. This really didn't matter to me because I worked all the time and didn't depend on anybody. I treated him as best as possible because I didn't want to lose his company. I had been feeling so alone, so terribly alone. But he always looked for me. We went out together, and every day his company became more indispensable to me. So every afternoon he would come home and we would eat together and talk for a while or watch television, and then he would go home to sleep. I felt so happy that I wanted to shout from the rooftops, the happiness I was experiencing. What I found most strange was that every time we got to the dance hall, the band would play the same piece of music. Since I couldn't understand the lyrics, much less the title of the song, I never realized that he had asked the band to play it for me each time. After a long time, I asked another person who could understand the lyrics to tell me what it had said, because I was really confused by the fact that they always played it only when I arrived. The song was called Good-Hearted Woman. That was what he wanted to tell me. That night when I returned home, I was left thinking about the bitter life I had had in my own country. I hadn't had a nice moment since I could remember. And now, after so many years, I really felt happy. I was having fun. I really felt like a teenager. I felt like telling everyone, shouting from the rooftops, that I had finally found this person who treated me the way I had always dreamed. So the passage ends there. And to this day, we still have no idea who David is. I have spent the last 4 weeks trying to search for him everywhere. I went to the library, I posted on Facebook, I looked through obituaries, I joined the Boise Musicians Facebook group and posted the story. 30 people responded and messaged me, all with different, maybe it's this David, maybe it's this David, maybe it's this band, maybe it's this venue, think about the Hi-Ho Club, or think about the Ranch Club, or all these different places. I've emailed and called strangers. People have been very kind to me, talking to me on the phone. And we still have no idea who David is. I kind of hit dead ends. I was trying to find the nephew that was in the band so I could track who David was. And we found bands, we found house bands, we found people who had uncles, but none of them named David. So I'm leaving Boise. Unfortunately, if you all know who David is, you all should come talk to me after today. Otherwise I'm leaving Boise without knowing who he was or where they went dancing or who his nephew was. But instead, I'm just going to reflect on what I do know and the reflections of what this passage meant for me to read it during Pride weekend and what it meant for me as a queer person. Outside of the first 53 numbered pages, the passage about David is the longest the passage about David is the longest continuous passage in the entire book. There are more than 100 pages worth of pain in this book, but the longest story I find is about love. For the first time in weeks of reading, I finally read my grandmother declare an emotion other than sadness, fear, humiliation. I really felt happy, she wrote. I was having fun. I really felt like a teenager. And after 160 pages of her diligent attention towards the craft of her sentences, in this passage, for the first time, she repeats a phrase, I wanted to shout to the rooftops. But she does not seem to care. It's as if in this passage, she cared less about craft and instead allowed herself to get swept away in her own story, all the feelings she had, the euphoria of them. How is it possible that in 160 pages, hardly anything from her time in the United States was saved, but these 4 pages were saved? This story, one of few stories in the entire book that remain almost entirely intact. It would have been so much harder to finish this manuscript without these pages, to have evidence in my lineage of only my grandmother's trauma, but never know if she ever might have experienced this too. In these pages, I discovered the lineage of pleasure I had been searching for forever. I could now make declarative sentences about what my ancestors desired, how they chased it, the pleasures they felt while alive. The manuscript would never give me evidence of my grandmother loving another woman, but this passage felt queer enough. I had evidence that my grandmother experienced sexuality outside of only trauma. Evidence of a romantic experience so good she had to write about it, shout it from the rooftops, save the pages for decades somehow, even when everything before and after it was lost. Evidence that at least for a period of time, the dreams of her desires were fulfilled. For me, queerness was never only about the gender I direct my desire towards. Queerness was about centering my desire above all else, refusing to contain my desire to better fit the rules and comfort of what everyone else wanted. Queerness to me is desire run rampant, desire in spite of trauma, desire even amidst impossible circumstances. This was the queer celebration I found in my grandmother's story. A woman who kept desiring love and pleasure, even when she had decades of reasons to never risk her body like that again. My grandmother was violated repeatedly for decades. And decades later, my body would be violated too. Both our bodies absorbing more and more violence, bodies that already carried 18 mothers worth of pain. And still, we both kept wanting. In my lineage, I don't know if any of the 18 mothers ever experienced love, pleasure, a fulfillment of genuine desire. I probably won't ever know. In all my ancestry research, I can collect hundreds of documents of marriage and children, but 0 documents of pleasure. Until these 4 pages, written by my grandmother, about a lover that is not a part of our family, a lover that no one else knows about. What could be more gay than that? So it's like a little epilogue. I'm going to read one final thing. And this piece is called Queer Lineage. The truth is, queer people do create lineage. Our specific brand of magic is doing this, even without having children. We infiltrate every single family, every bloodline, even without our own DNA and blood. We don't need to use the labor of our bodies to keep reproducing. We keep living on regardless. I am endlessly mesmerized by the beauty of this. Queerness as this bloodless thing that always still survives. It needs no direct ancestor and still gets passed down somehow over and over again. Our magic is that we conjure ancestors from thin air. With nothing more tangible than just energetic precedents, we create a whole beautiful lineage of erotic life. Queer lineage means some things survive no matter how many times people erase them, hide them, disown them, estrange them. It means that genocide doesn't always work. It means erasure will always be a failed project. That even after holocausts and inquisitions and lavender scares and viruses and conversion therapy, queer people are a bloodless people who always keep relentlessly existing. It means that even after patriarchy and 18 generations of coerced marriage and rape, the desires of our ancestors still reach out to us, still speak, still awaken in our bodies when we least expect them. It means that even when there is no record of us, we can still feel in our bodies who we are. We will always feel when the erased thing comes back. We will always know when it's time to listen. Thank you all.
Wow.
I secretly have a drink down here. That's my secret.
That's very queer. Very, very queer. We are going to open for a little bit of a discussion or questions. We do have some people watching online as well. So if you would like to type a question in the comments, there is a little bit of a delay, but I should be able to see that and relay that as well. Some other things, we have a number of people in the room right now who are part of a workshop that happened just a few days ago, which was Writing Immigrant Queerness. And one of the things that I shared during that workshop as people were introducing themselves and saying why they were there is it became quite emotional for me because it was such a moment of just clarity of the importance of having a place like Searle's Place and supporting the work that we dream of supporting here. Tonight is another example of that, so thank you so much for that. One of the things that was a new idea to me during that workshop was the idea of queerness being an immigrant story, which I had never framed it that way or thought of it that way. Because originally when I came, I was like, well, I'm here because I'm the program director. I don't have an immigrant story to tell, really. I have so many. I'm 5th generation Boise, so the story has gotten very thin. But, realizing, oh, maybe there is more of a story here. Do we want to start? Does anyone have a pressing question right away that you would like to ask? Yes.
I'm curious if your uncle read the manuscript. Had he already read it before you got it?
And I'm just going to repeat the question because I have a mic and you don't. So the question on the floor is, do you know if your uncle read the manuscript before you did?
Yeah, I think he did. He's older, so I think he forgets parts of it. When I went to go see him a few weeks ago and looked at the original manuscript again and read the David passage, and he had forgotten it. So either he read it in chunks but didn't read certain pages or forgot certain things, or he's just, like over time needs a refresher. So it was a really special experience to read the David passage out loud to him and have him also, he was like, that's definitely Boise, but I have no idea who that man is.
So the original manuscript remains with your uncle, and you
I
travel around with a photocopy?
I felt like because he had preserved it for so many years, I couldn't take it from him.
Yeah.
A wild story that also happened was that 2 weeks after I left Iowa, after I had photocopied it, Iowa flooded. It was the worst flood they'd ever had in years, climate change. And the manuscript could have been lost. My uncle's house completely flooded, and he had to move to disaster relief housing, which is where he was living when I went to go see him a few weeks ago. And the manuscript was in a plastic bag that he had just picked up to take. So that was just another moment that I'm like, there's an urgency to this. I'm feeling it in the air that this thing, could get lost at any moment. So,
wow.
Yeah.
How about over there?
Hi.
I already mentioned this, but do you have any siblings, and have you shared with them some of this story, and also the other women in your family, how aware they are of the grandmother?
Yeah.
Do you have siblings or other members of your family that you've been actively sharing your work with your grandmother's manuscript?
Yeah, well, I have two brothers. They're much older than I am. They both know about it. One was just didn't seem to want to have anything to do with it, which I respect and understand. The other was curious to have me talk about it, but he was too scared to read it himself. So he was like, I'll let you text me the highlights, but I don't know if I'm ready to read it yet. So that's where they're at with it. What was also amazing about this residency actually was that the first week I got here, I reconnected with a cousin who is the daughter of one of Margarita, my grandmother's sons. And I had not talked to her in years. And we reconnected while I was here. We had the conversation right at that desk. And then after that, a week later, I was like, I'm going to call another cousin I haven't talked to in years. So I called my cousin Deanna, and we chatted for a little while. So I also feel like the role of the manuscript is to get me to be reconnected to the family somehow. Even though admittedly, I have not told these cousins about the manuscript yet. We just reconnected just to talk for the first time in decades. But I feel like that's the next step once I leave here, is to now talk about this more openly, which starts with today. I guess the first time I'm actually sharing about this with the group publicly.
Do you have a cousin named Daria?
No.
Okay, that's good, because Daria is watching right now. And it's not really a question, but I thought I would share. Daria says, oh my God, so good. I'm so proud of you. I thought I'd fall asleep only because I'm exhausted and I couldn't stop listening. What an amazing and touching story. And the way you shared it was really, really good.
Yay! So the story with her is that she's the reason I have this manuscript, honestly.
Oh.
So when I left that residency, I got in a car with her and just kind of half-assed off the, it was just my grandma had this diary, but it probably doesn't exist. And, my uncle told me his address, but I'm not going to fly over there and find it. And she looked at me and she's like, you need to fly over there and find it, right now. And I'm like, that's crazy. I'd have to rent a car. And I'm just and she was like, when are you going to have a chance to find your grandmother's diary? So she was the pep talk from the reading. She was the pep talk in the car. And she was like, I think you should see if it flows, and if it flows, you're meant to do it. And it was totally right that the moment I was like, okay, I'm gonna try to go to Iowa, things just started falling into place. So yeah, I'm so grateful she's on this call. I owe a lot of this to her.
Oh, that's wonderful. Do you imagine who your grandmother thought her audience for this would be? When she wrote this, who was she writing it to?
I have no idea. That's what I wish I could ask her.
Yeah.
I also thought about the ethics of it. I read so many articles about people who publish writers' work after they die. And I know that, I think right now there's a lot of controversies about families disregarding people's wills, where in the will they say don't publish this, but they publish it anyways. So I asked my uncle, like, did she ever say not to publish this? Did she ever say she didn't want it shared? And he didn't know. He was like, she showed it to me once and then she put it in the attic and she just never really talked about it again. So I think from that, I'm just like, I think that you could go both ways, right? There's an argument that she didn't want anyone to see it, but there's also an argument that she just kind of gave up on it or didn't know what platform to publish it or how to like share it with the world. And I guess during lots of reflection and trying to talk to her over these last few months, I felt ethically like it was okay to share it, and that I felt like she was writing it maybe as some kind of way to be witnessed. Her life was really hard. And that's kind of intuitively how I feel, that she just wanted someone to see what she had been through. And I think it's one thing for me to read it, but I think that's why today I was like, I think it's time. I think she wants this shared with other people.
Well, I mean, some clues seem like the tone of the piece, like just that excerpt you wrote about finding out, like, what is the song that they play every time I come in?
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't written as notes to herself. Like,
no.
When I think about writing I've done, that's just me. I'm like, oh, I wonder if this is a thing, and da-da-da-da-da, but this was describing places, events, dialogue. Yeah.
She uses so many literary techniques. She's actually like a pretty sound writer. Like you can tell she's trying to figure out how to put the pieces together. So I knew that the way she wrote it was meant to be a book to be shared. I guess what I didn't know is if like by the end of her life, she still felt that way.
Yeah.
And I have just, through a lot of reflection, chosen to believe that she did, and that had she known that she could be at Searle's place sharing her book, she might have said, yes, I would do that in Boise where I wrote it. So, yeah.
I also loved that you brought out how you can read the revisions and how that revealed more of her personality and more of her work as a writer, because you could see more of the process.
Yeah.
Is there, and I don't know eventually what this looks like, if there's a section by your grandmother and a section by yourself, if this is an essay or it's a full book, but do you imagine that flipping between her words and yours, and I wonder if there's a way for you to expose your revisions and process. It's a lot harder
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a lot harder to do that now because you're probably typing it out.
Yeah, although I look at Google Docs version history, and then you can see all of your edits. I do that every time I publish something. I look back on all the versions on Google Docs to see what edits I've done. I never thought to include that in the actual writing, though. So you need to give me another month residency, so I can do all of it.
You're right. The revision of the residency.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've been writing it here has been kind of like response, like her passage translated, and then my letter to her about like the questions I have, the things I'm thinking about, the way it reflects my own life, the patterns I'm seeing. So that's how it's structured now. But yeah, I found her revisions really, really interesting. When I went to see the manuscript just a few weeks ago, there was even a passage where she crossed out a paragraph, took another little piece of paper and scotch taped it over it, and then wrote the paragraph on there. So it was just like, the most kind of do-it-yourself writing project. But yeah, it like showed that she really cared. She really wanted it to like sound good. There's a question back there.
We have a question about whether David and Grandma stayed together. What happened with that relationship?
So I know they didn't stay together because by the time I met my grandmother, she was a single woman living in Los Angeles in her herbalist store. And then she lived in Iowa selling her medicine and died there. Single also, from what I understand. I mean, she's full of surprises, so who knows? Maybe there's things I don't know. But from what I know, she never got married again. I know that much. So yeah, I don't know. And no one that I've talked to so far in the family has any memory of what that relationship was like. So I have no idea.
I see another hand over here on this side. Yeah.
I was just curious about the tinctures and what happened to you when you were at that residency in, was it Massachusetts?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm just really curious, like, did you feel like any kind of way that she might have been indirectly trying to communicate with you or something? That might be too supernatural giving, but I'm just curious about the tinctures and how maybe you felt connected somehow, and I don't know, other ways of her communicating with you. Does that make sense what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, yeah.
I was really curious about that.
Our last question was about the success of Grandma's relationship with David, and this question is about the success of Amanda's being haunted. How did Grandma manifest?
So the first 30 pages of the book describe that process. I just decided not to read it for this. It was really hard to choose what to read, but I guess I'll share it, or parts of it, like kind of like a summary of it. I took an herbalist class a few years ago, which felt like step one in like confronting my estranged grandmother. And then I would travel with her medicine, and every time I traveled somewhere else, I would put the tinctures on the land that I was on. So if I was hiking or in the woods or in the river, like I would kind of like as a little offering. And then one time when I did it, I felt this intense energy, and it freaked me out. And so I never did it again. I was like, nope, not ready, Grandma. Thank you. We're done. And so I didn't do it until that residency. What had ended up happening actually was that I started writing an excerpt that I read today about queer lineage and queerness and my grandmother's like non-conventional life. And when I wrote the sentence, maybe there's something queer about my grandmother too, the smudge stick that I had burned started, like it burst into flames. Like it just exploded. So much that smoke filled the entire room, and I had to like run to the kitchen. I was in a residency. I'm like, I'm gonna burn this place down. Like I can't do this. So I ran to the sink, like poured water on it, and then like looked around, and I was like, what is going on? Like what is happening? Wow. So that's actually what kind of started it. That like there's some connection between me writing about queerness and writing about her, and that was when I remembered the manuscript. It was right after that.
We don't allow incense at Searles Place.
I asked many times.
That had to be left for the Massachusetts residency.
I was going to smudge everyone here today, but Jody was like, no.
On the way in. On the way in. Natalia. Yeah. Question about Amanda's writing process, particularly with this project, going back and forth between her grandmother's manuscript. Is that process feel like it's set, or is it going in stages? Are you in contact with the manuscript? I might be adding on to your question a little bit. Are you continuing to be with the manuscript at the same amount, or is it increasing or decreasing? Or do you see a path developing in how you work like this?
It's a really good question. You guys are asking really good questions. So the first step actually after I finished reading the manuscript was to transcribe and translate all of it. I still haven't finished translating all of it, only the excerpts I've been using, but I transcribed the whole thing. So actually what my goal is to first kind of have a published version that's just her, that is like called a memoir by Margarita Andrews or Margarita Rodriguez. I still don't know which name to use since she had so many lovers. I'm like, which name do I use, Grandma? But a memoir by her, and then just have all of, the manuscript as it is, with like editor's notes of all the missing pages where like I've like put together kind of details of the stories that are kind of incomplete. So that's kind of step one.
That's in English.
That's in Spanish.
Oh, that'll
and
be
then
in
I want to
Spanish.
translate it.
Spanish.
Yeah, because that's where the original is in Spanish. So I want to have an original version that's transcribed so that people don't have to just read her cursive, which is really difficult. And so it's like much more organized. And then I think through the transcribing of it, that's when I started realizing that I'd already been writing in my journal in response to her all the time. And like maybe I could have my own project on this too. But I only started that in December and then have continued that until now. So I don't know if I have like an answer to your question because it still feels early. I think right now I have 200 pages of writing that's both like the how did I get here with her, like what was our relationship like before? How did she start to haunt me? How did I start to listen to her? And then what was the journey of going to Iowa to retrieve it? And then what was it like to read it? And then the last, the 40 pages I wrote here, where it was, what is it like to be in Boise looking for David, and going to her house on Longmont Street and walking by the river she probably walked by 1,000 times, and reconnecting with my cousins and just starting to like piece together the last pieces of this. So yeah, I still don't know what the ending of the story is, and I'm not sure if the the style I have now or the organization I have now is going to continue. I feel like I'll probably have to like give it rest for a little while and then come back to it after a few months and see what feels right. Because right now it has been like a lot of like urgent writing, it feels like just kind of like live as it's happening, churning out and like releasing things. I hope that answers your question.
One more comment online, just because I'm not sure you'll see these later.
Oh, okay.
This is from Michelle. So proud of you. You spoke with such grace and confidence. I loved all of your passages and was moved to finally hear your words and see how perfectly they blended with Margarita's words and experiences. So moved by how beautifully you tied your world to hers. Congratulations on this first part of your journey.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna cry. Can
Me
you
too.
screenshot these?
Me
Can somebody
too.
take a screenshot?
Yeah, I think there's a way we can preserve them. I just don't trust it.
Oh my god.
All right.
Michelle was the person who helped me translate the manuscript.
Oh.
So she's also Mexican American, and our family lineages have a lot of similarities and a lot of parallels. There's a lot of stories that her grandmother had that are very similar to mine. And so at a lot of residencies, she would call me and we would Zoom and I would send her screenshots of the cursive manuscript. And we would try to decipher words where I can't read the handwriting, or when there's a Spanish word that I just couldn't understand because it's slang from the 60s that I just don't get or can't figure out. Michelle was just like pivotal and helped me, figure out so much of it.
Oh, what a beautiful tribe. We're going to end things for this formal part and let a little bit of mingling happen. If you have any one-on-one questions you want to ask Amanda, we are going to be a little sensitive about time because Amanda has a flight that is way too early for a human being. So we're not going to linger too long, but we also don't want to throw you out on your heads right away. There's probably more snacks and drinks back there too. If you're not on our mailing list, I think we have a sign-up sheet back here. There's also a donation box. And I will tell you that our next event here is right away. We're doing a flash show with the Backyard Artists that opens this Friday and runs also on Saturday and Sunday. It's covering 4 venues, so we call that the holdover house because it's the leftover bungalow between the 4-story single-family homes. And then the Green Box, which is our installation space here, and then the tiny house next door. And that information is all available online as well. But I want to come back to thanking this beautiful person for all that you've brought to our community and how you've brought this community together and filling a void, I think, that probably a lot of particularly queer writers have felt living in Boise, Idaho. So to be able to come together and be shepherded in such a beautiful way, and also for you to be so generous in sharing your own journey with both queerness, with lineage and trauma, and also tonight we were very happy to be able to add the second part with the pleasure. So thanks again to Amanda Machado.
Thank you so much.